Retirement is extremely important to everyone and something that you have to take very seriously. And it can be very overwhelming for those that don't know how to invest for their future. Today, we're going to be looking at 4 different portfolios that all are very similar and are only 3 positions each, which means that you don't have to look into a bunch of stocks. You don't have to look into a bunch of different positions and different things to invest your money into. We're going to be looking at 3 positions. So by the end of this, we can take away what portfolio will be best for you, and I would highly suggest checking this out for yourself. So the very first thing that we're going to see is, of course, the colors. And at the top, we're going to have yellow, which is the ETF one. Then we're going to have red, which is Vanguard. We're going to have Fidelity, which is green. And then we're going to also have Charles Schwab, which is going to be blue, okay? And we're going to have a ton of stats here. And what we're going to be looking at is this is all categorized as well. So for VTI, VTSAX, FSKAX, and SWTSX are all going to be the total U.S. market fund. The second one in each one of these lists is the total international fund. And then the third one is going to be their version of the bond, okay? And the very first thing that we look at after that, getting into the number section of this all, is going to be the expense ratio. The lower that expense ratio is, the more money that you get to keep in your pocket. First one is going to be, let's just go through and look at the total U.S. market fund, and we can see like all these expense ratios are actually deemed very low, which is a really good thing. And we're looking at the highest one going to be the total international fund from Vanguard, which is the VTIAX at 0.12%, and that's still relatively low and recommended. Now, of course, like I said, we want to go as low as possible, and the lowest one in this category for like the total U.S. market fund is going to be the Fidelity one, which is FSKAX, and the lowest one expense ratio for a total international fund is going to be the FSPSX, which is again by Fidelity. And then when we look at for the bonds, we can see that it's a tiebreaker between BND with the ETF version and then FXNAX. But we can see that Fidelity kind of wins out in the expense ratio category here, which is a good thing. When we move on to the minimum deposits, we can see that ETFs, they do not have a minimum deposit and they don't have a transaction fee either, which is going to be very well going into the future. And it's not necessarily saying that this is a bad thing, but it's something to consider when you're investing for your future, because something like Vanguard, where all 3 of these positions, you have to invest at least $2,500 up front, and they do have a transaction fee of $75 to $95, and this could be subject to change as well, but that is currently what it's at. For Fidelity, they don't have any minimum deposits on any 3 of their categories, but they do have a transaction fee for FSKAX, which is their total U.S. market fund. And again, that ranges between like 75 to 95. That can always be subject to change. When we look at Charles Schwab, they have all 3 of them. Their bonds, their total U.S. market, and their international fund all has a $2,500 minimum investment, and they have a transaction fee. So that is something to consider as well. And none of these are bad. Just because it has a transaction fee, just because it has a minimum investment, doesn't mean that it's a bad investment at all, okay? But it's something to consider when investing into your future. When we scroll along here, what I put together is the 3-year, 5-year, and the 10-year average rate of return. And then after that, we can look into the life of the fund average return. And remember how we did this. The top one's going to be the total U.S. market, the second one's the total international market, and the third one's the bonds. Bonds are supposed to be extremely conservative, and the total U.S. market is usually the best at generating the most revenue, and the total international usually just kind of stays a little bit lower because the rest of the world just can't seem to keep up with the U.S. as of right now, but they have done it in the past. So that's why it's important to invest internationally as well, because they can beat the U.S. They will beat the U.S. at times, and it's something to just broaden your portfolio for your future. So at the 3-year return, when we're looking at the total US market one, so we're going to be looking at the top one for every category, we can easily see here that there's a tie between the Vanguard one and the Charles Schwab one. So that would come down to your VTSAX and your SWTSX. Those are going to be the two winners there at the tiebreakers. Now, when we look at the international one, that's when things get a little bit more spicy. We can see that the average rate of return is a little bit lower here, right? With the top one being Fidelity's, which is FSPSX at 4.3%, okay? And that's not saying that you can't just mix and match some of these positions, right? If you see here and you're like, hey, I like the Vanguard one and I like the Fidelity one here and I like the ETF over here, you don't have to stick to this color code. You can branch out any way you want, because when we look at the bonds here, they're supposed to be conservative, but we can see in the 3-year return that they've all done negative, and the best one here is going to be the Fidelity one, FX and AX, okay, but it's still negative. And to me, playing too conservative is actually like a negative, right? You got to play a little bit risky, I believe, but we can get into that into another video. For the 5-year return percentage, that's when we get to some bigger numbers in here, and that's a good thing. We get to see more of a consistency. And again, Fidelity wins out in the total US market fund, right? And then for the total international fund, we get to see a pretty close one here for the most part, but Fidelity wins out again. And then for the bonds, though, the bonds, they don't win out. And actually, the ETF BND wins out with a 0.22% average rate of return for 5 years, which I think is a good thing to look at. And we can see that there's not always a clear winner here in every category, because when we move on to the 10-year average rate of return for all of these positions, we can actually see for the total US market fund that it's still pretty close between all 4 of these, right? And that is something that I want to hone in on, because these are all kind of close. And when we go into the life of the fund, you'll see that as well. And there might be an outlier here or there, but for the most part, all of these funds you really can't go wrong with. And I think it's going to come down to almost like a color code. Like, which one do you like? Do you like Fidelity's green? Do you like Charles Schwab's blue? Do you like Vanguard's red, right? And so for the 10-year average rate of return for the total US market, the winner for the past 10 years has actually, on the average rate of return, has actually come down to the ETF, which is going to be VTI. And this is a good thing there for the ETF. And we get to see some more winning out of that. With the total international market, as we can see, they're kind of just mid-single digits, but the winner here is going to be the Fidelity one, FSPSX. And I think that's something to know, because like I said, you can mix and match these. You can always mix and match these. There's nothing wrong with going, hey, this one went out here, this one went out here. It is important to know, just because we look at the past, it has no representation of how the future is going to hold either. Because of course, when we go into look at the bonds, we can see it's kind of a close tie here between the ETF and the Vanguard version, and then Charles Schwab's has not applicable because it hasn't been out for 10 years yet, but then we do have Fidelity winning out at a 1.67. We can scroll over some more though, and we can see the life of the average rate of return for all of these. And we have to understand though, when we're looking at this, that each one of these funds have been out for a different time period. So some are going to be longer and some are going to be shorter. But when we look at this though, we can see that it's ultimately VTI that takes the winner here at the life of the fund. When we look at the total international fund, we can actually see here, we got a couple 5s, we got a couple 4s, and ultimately it's going to come down to Fidelity that wins out in the total international fund. And then the bonds, this is where it gets a little interesting. Like Charles Schwab's at 1%, we have the BND at 2.88%. But then the winner here with Fidelity and Vanguard, they're close, and Vanguard wins with its bond at 5.12% VBTLX. And I think that is also interesting. Now, if you were to take the average total return invested for the life of the fund and divide it equally about how much money you put it in, and you just took that average number, not saying this is like how it actually would come out, but this is where we can start looking at what the winner would be of the past. But again, this is not any indication of how the future is going to be for these funds. If we were to do what I just said here with the average total return invested equally between each three of these funds, we would come out with the ETF at 5.283%, Vanguard at 6.84%, Fidelity at 6.45%, and Charles Schwab's underperforming the rest of them at 4.93%, which I think is kind of impressive that they didn't like stay in line as much as the other three did. But again, they do have a higher transaction fee. They do have more of a minimum investment, and their expense ratios are just slightly higher. Average rate of return has been a little bit lower, is because this is all like considered their expense ratio and everything else. So the winner overall, if we were to do it like perfectly, would actually come out to be Vanguard. Now, the one that I specifically invest in is going to be the Fidelity one at 6.45%, and that is going to be your FSKAX, the FSPSX, and the FXNAX. And I don't currently invest in any bonds because I'm trying to be very aggressive because I'm 26 years old. Now, of course, this is my risk management. The other thing that I really like about Fidelity is they have the lowest expense ratios that we see across the board. So it's something that I set up for my future, and at a 0.4% difference, I don't think is going to be game changing. And even if you choose to go with Charles Schwab, it's not going to be a bad idea. The bad idea is not investing in your future.